I have, and we put 3 or 4 of those books in the library. So I'm talking to the intelligentsia here and saying, if you want to contact me, I can set up a time when we could go to the library. And if you're interested in books and you name it,
I would be.
I probably have multiple copies of it.
I would be more than happy. I will email you or text
Yeah,
email you.
there's okay.
We definitely want to make sure that our books
So
can get good use and have good homes. You know, we want to keep a good library, but we also
Yes.
want to help people build their own Jewish library.
I think right. Okay, that's it.
That's your public service announcement for the day.
Before we begin, I have a quick question for Natan. Is your class this weekend?
No, I can't because I have a bat mitzvah in a different synagogue that they invited us. So sadly, I can't. I was thinking to go there to the our class and jump to the other, and my wife say, "Are you nuts? Are you crazy? Why you want to kill yourself? Just relax and enjoy the Shabbat." Okay.
Go and enjoy the simcha. It's a great thing.
Yeah.
You know, as I said before, as we were just starting, you know, I won't be teaching tonight or tomorrow night because of various honors for Hannah, and tomorrow night another honor for Nathaniel for his first year of middle school. It happens, you know, and these are things we should be happy and proud of, even if they're not always at the most convenient times.
It's kudos for you and Penelope because it's all about the parents. The parents
I'd like to give our children some credit.
But you know what? I'm telling you also, not only as a realtor, but also as an educator, it's all about the parents. You see the difference when the parents are engaged, they care, and they're involved in the education of the kids. The difference is huge. Every kid has a potential, really, to do great things, but they need the push, the discipline, and the organization from home.
That is absolutely true. That it's, and I won't say it's 100% the parents, but the parents can certainly ruin things, unfortunately. The parents need to be there to support. It's always been a team effort, and people underestimate the impact that parents have on their kids. I'm always staggered that people think, oh, my kids don't listen to me, they don't pay attention to me, they're only listening, you know, to their friends and TV and YouTube. But no, parents are a huge influence on their children, and that is absolutely true. So with that as a segue, I'll try and awkwardly push us into our Torah reading for today in Parashat Emor in Leviticus 22. We're going to talk about Aaron and his sons, although we're not going to talk about them too much. We're going to talk about a very interesting addendum to the laws of the sacrifices. Now, I know that whenever I say sacrifices, everybody goes, oh, why we're in Emor? Why can't we be talking about the holidays, the Chagim? They're so much more interesting. Trust me, we need to continue to hammer over the material of the sacrifices, even if it is not as immediately obviously relevant to us, because the sacrifices are one of the places where we learn the deepest ideas of how to come before God in any context. And coming before God, even if we can't do it with sacrifices, is something that we are still striving to do in many other aspects of Jewish life. So with that as the small hope that you have of why we're going to be talking about sacrifices again, let's jump into it. So we are in Vayikra, Leviticus 22. And we begin where we almost always begin in these chapters. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, instruct Aaron and his sons to be scrupulous, to be careful about the sacred donations that the Israelite people consecrate to me, lest they profane my holy name, mine the Lord's. All right, so just to set the stage here, God is saying you need to be very, very careful how you handle these sacrifices because we want to make sure that the Israelite people will consecrate God's name. Now, how do we consecrate God? God is already holy. How do we make God holier? And indeed, how would we deholify, right? How can we actually make God's name profane? So let's untangle that English a little bit because it's important for a general understanding of the rest of this chapter. So when we're talking about making God holy, we mean acting in a way which reflects God's holiness. God's holiness is a fixed point, infinite. It cannot be increased or decreased. So when we act in ways that increase the perception of God's holiness, we are consecrating God. When we act in ways that decrease the perceived holiness of God, then we are desecrating God or desecrating God's name. So that's what we mean when we keep using this term to sanctify or desecrate, to consecrate or profane God or God's name. We're not changing God because that doesn't happen. It's definitely not within our power to change God. And indeed, by many definitions of what God is, it's not in God's power to change God, because if God could change, then whatever God used to be would have been less than what God has now become, or whatever God has become is less than what God used to be. Either way, you're saying there was a less perfect version of God, and that doesn't work. So we'll leave that theology aside for another longer conversation in philosophy class. Let's carry on with verse 3. Say to them, throughout the ages, if any man among your offspring, while in a state of uncleanness, partakes of any sacred donation that the Israelite people may consecrate to the Lord, that person shall be cut off from before me. I am the Lord. And we talked about the idea of karet, of being cut off in our previous class. But here we see the general prohibition that a person who is in a state of ritual impurity should not be partaking of or offering a sacrifice. No man of Aaron's offspring who has an eruption or a discharge shall eat of the sacred donations until he is clean. If one touches anything made unclean by a corpse, or if a man has an emission of semen, or if a man touches any swarming thing by which he is made unclean, or any human being by whom he is made unclean, whatever his uncleanness, the person who touches such shall be unclean until evening, and shall not eat of the sacred donations until he has washed his body in water. As soon as the sun sets, he shall be clean, and afterwards he may eat of the sacred donations, for they are his food, right? That is his portion. All right, so far this may sound a little bit redundant. Haven't we talked about uncleanliness before? But this is simply giving the clearest example, especially for the Kohanim themselves, of the things that can cause uncleanliness, the limits that places on the Kohanim, and the method for remedying them in general. We pick up on verse 8. He shall not eat anything that died or was torn by beasts, thereby becoming unclean. I am the Lord. They shall keep my charge, lest they incur guilt thereby and die from it, having committed profanation. Great word. I, the Lord, consecrate them. All right, so as you can see, we're having this whole play on words at the end of this section, just like we did at the beginning, of making something profane, making something unholy, and making something holy. Although here we're seeing that it actually is God that is consecrating them. And that does work because God certainly has the ability to raise or lower our standard of holiness. Now, having talked about the Kohanim, we're now going to begin to introduce the concept of the non-Kohanim more explicitly. So verse 10, no layperson shall eat of the sacred donation. No bound or hired laborer of a priest shall eat of the sacred donation. But a person who is a priest's property by purchase may eat of them, and thus those that are born into his household may eat of them. So first category, that among these special foods, and by the way, if you want to know a little bit more about this, we have touched on them during our weeks of discussion of Yevamot in the Mishnah class. that there are certain things that the priest can share with the household, and this is putting a definition on what that household means. And that continues to then have to specify, well, what about his daughter? If a priest's daughter marries a layman, meaning a non-priest, she may not eat of the sacred gifts. But if the priest's daughter is widowed or divorced, meaning her husband is now gone to her, and without offspring, which would anchor her within his family, and is back in her father's house, as in her youth, she may eat of her father's food. No layperson may eat of it. Again, that solid reminder that it only works if she is detached from the laity of her husband's family. But if a man eats of a sacred donation unwittingly, he shall pay the priest for the sacred donation, adding 1/5 of its value. But the priests must not allow the Israelites to profane the sacred donations that they set aside for the Lord, or to incur guilt requiring a penalty payment by eating such sacred donations, for it is I, the Lord, who make them sacred. All right, so another section is being ended with this idea of the sanctity and of the restrictions of who can and can't eat from what comes from the altar. Is everyone with me so far? I know we're getting a lot of text. Hopefully it's relatively clear. The idea I want you to be taking away from this for the short term is that there are very strict rules on who can and who cannot offer, and who can and who cannot eat from the offerings. And that this seems to be of particular interest to this chapter of Leviticus.
I have a question.
All
I don't
right,
know.
not seen. Yes.
We'll cover it. David eating the bread, which was set out on the altar, would seem to be a case in which this section is relevant.
So I don't actually want to go down that path today, because
Okay.
we're actually going to move on beyond this concept into a parallel. So right now, I just want to leave it as the paradigm of who can and who can't, and
Okay.
I don't want to get too much into the occasional exceptions that we see from that. Sorry, it's just it's like you said, it's a big path of that topic, but one that would, I think, take away from our ability to finish the other material.
Okay, but I'm correct that this would be an issue that relates to this section.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, very relevant as one of the paths out of this text to additional conversation and study. Just not the path that I want to go down today. Instead, we're going to go down a path which is going to seem slightly less important and slightly less human focused. So beginning in verse 17, we've now talked about who can offer. We've talked about who can eat. We're now going to talk about what can be offered. Thus spoke the Lord to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron and his sons and to all the Israelite people, and say to them, when any man of the house of Israel or the strangers in Israel present a burnt offering, as his offering for any of the votive or any of the free will offerings that they offer to the Lord, it must, to be acceptable in your favor, be a male without blemish from cattle or sheep or goats. You shall not offer any that have a defect, for it will not be accepted in your favor." So we're going to get to some more details, but I want to make sure we get the general gist of this. That when a person is bringing these offerings, that the offering has to be a non-blemished animal from among their property. And that if it is blemished, if it does have, the term that was used is mum, if it does have this blemish, then it is unacceptable as an offering on the altar. Now, what does that mean in more detail? Well, the Torah helps us. And when a man offers from the herd or the flock a sacrifice of well-being to the Lord for an explicit vow or as a free will offering, it must be to be acceptable, be without blemish. There must be no defect in it. Anything blind or injured or maimed, or with a wen, boil scar, or scurvy, such you shall not offer to the Lord. You shall not put any of them on the altar as an offering by fire to the Lord. You may, however, present as a free will offering, what's called the nidava in this case, offering an ox or a sheep with a limb extended or contracted, but it will not be accepted for a vow, a neder. So I know that nidava and neder seem very similar. We're going to look at those terms in a little bit more detail in our commentary. So the nidava here is being translated as a free will offering, a voluntary offering. And the neder offering is an offering that would generally be considered to be the fulfillment of a vow, when someone had made a particular vow and now was bringing the offering to pay for the vow that they had made. All right. What in the world is going on here? And what does 24 and 25 tell us? Because it seems to then becoming a curveball. You shall not offer to the Lord anything with its testes bruised or crushed or torn or cut. You shall have no such practices in your own land, nor shall you accept such animals from a foreigner for offering as food for your God. For they are mutilated, they have a defect, they shall not be accepted in your favor. So, wait a minute. These are an additional list of maimings that would disqualify an animal. And they are saying that they will not be accepted even if done by a foreigner, when a foreigner, of course, would not be bound by the prohibition on doing such. So this part 24 and 25 is not the path we're going to go down today, but as another path that leads from this chapter to a very interesting discussion. This section is where we begin to see the rather strong limitations on the neutering of animals within Jewish law. Jewish law is not a big fan of castration or neutering of an animal. There are certain exceptions, which really are quite complicated, so we're not going to go into them in detail. But I did want to make sure that you noticed that this was also part of the discussion. Okay. With that in mind, and seeing that we've already got 20 minutes in, because I wanted to show you the whole pattern of the who can and who can eat, or who can offer, who can eat the offering, and what can be offered in the first place, means we have less time for our commentaries. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in, unless there is a part specifically on this section about the blemishes that you need quick clarification on. Before we look at the commentary on it.
I was just going to say the bruised or torn testicles, that's how, male cattle are turned into steer beef. It has commonly been done for many centuries that you would crush the testicles in order to make the beef cattle fatter.
Right, and very common practice, very widely practiced across the world. It was absolutely commonplace, and it's unusual to see here a prohibition on doing something that was considered so ubiquitous, so present in the world. Now, one thing before we jump into our next page, just because that's the difficulty of having it be digital and you're all staring at this page and then going back and forth, is that verse 23 tells us that there are certain things, the limbs being unusual, that nevertheless allow it to be offered as a nidava, as that free will offering, but it cannot be offered as a neder, as a vow offering. And that's going to be our head scratcher that starts us into our discussion with our commentators of, wait a minute, what's the difference between this type of blemish and all of the blemishes that were listed in verse 20 through 22 and the general prohibition that was mentioned in 21. So,
right.
With that in mind, oops, I thought I was rolled to the top. And let me get my screen set up. Sorry. Technology is a blessing and a curse. Okay. So that sarua, that animal that has one limb larger than its fellow limb, right? That is the phrase that Rashi is using. Again, let me just point you back to where we are here in verse 23, if you are looking. So we have this sarua and kalut, and he says that the word sarua is a longer leg, but he says that the kalut is an animal which has uncloven hooves. Now, you might be a little surprised about the idea of an uncloven hoofed animal. And indeed, Rashi is using shorthand here. Obviously, no uncloven hoofed animal was ever allowed as an offering. So what in the world is being discussed here? It's talking about a birth defect where the hoof did not open itself up. Just like with humans, animals sometimes are born with genetic defects. And for animals that have cloven hoofs, the hoof in two parts, sometimes the animal grows and the hoof is joined together. Now, many other commentators read this not as being the uncloven, but as being the opposite of the tsarua, of the short limb, as being the long limb and the short limb. But this is Rashi's interpretation, is that these type of animals are not allowed for the neder offering, but they are allowed for the nidava, the free will offering. But what is a nidava? What kind of offering is that? Because it still seems unusual that this would be what's going on the altar. Well, Rashi again leads us through. You may designate it for a free will offering for the purpose of repairing the breaches in the temple from the proceeds of its sale. So he's saying that the animals that go for the nidava are not actually going to be offered in the traditional sense of the word. They're not going to end up on the altar. Instead, they will be taken, sold, and the cash will be used for the maintenance of the building, for buying lumber and stone and hiring work people to be able to repair anything that's happening in the temple. As back in those days, just like now, sometimes you get a leaky roof in your house of worship and you need to pay for the repairs. And his argument, based off the Talmud, is that this nidava is specifically talking about animals donated not for the altar, but for this other purpose. As opposed to the neder, but as a vow, this is an animal that was vowed for the altar, for sacrifice. It shall not be accepted. So what he has said is that there is a separate level of criteria, that if the animal is being donated to be sold, that it can be a more blemished animal than an animal that is being donated for a sacrifice. Sacrificial animals have a higher standard. They must be more rigorously examined to make sure that they are physically perfect specimens, as opposed to animals that are just going to be sold and the proceeds used for the holy purpose of maintaining the building. Does everyone follow that distinction? Okay. So when we have that end, just want to make sure
that we
yeah,
saw
go ahead.
like that. Sorry, I think that we saw something like that in Shkalim, correct?
Correct, exactly. In Masechet Shkalim, which were studied recently in the Daf Yomi cycle, there was a discussion of the animals that could be taken and sold for purposes of the construction and maintenance of the temple precincts. In fact, Shkalim as a whole is a fascinating section of how do we maintain our holy places in keeping with the laws of the Torah. And like I said, maintenance is an important and sacred duty. We just need to know what criteria are involved in handling. So the Rashi continues with that last half where he says that if you bring an animal that has even one of these more minor defects, which would be accepted as a free will offering for the maintenance of the building, but will not be accepted as a neder, that if you did bring it anyway for the vow offering, that it will not be accepted. Now, this translation likes to use the fancy word, there shall not be propitiation, because that is perhaps a more direct translation of the Hebrew, that it will not be what is wanted or desire, and therefore it will not be pleasing to God. And the commentary that Rashi brings from Sifra on this is, what dedicated thing is it that is intended to effect propitiation? You must admit that it is something dedicated to the altar. Consequently, vow can only mean a sacrifice for the altar. So what he is trying to tell us is that when it says our free will offering, our nidava, and then it says our vow offering, our neder, that the neder must be a generic term for altar sacrifice, and the nidava must be a generic term for building maintenance sacrifice or offering, gift. Gift is better English. Now, that doesn't seem immediately obvious. However, Rashi is trying to argue that because it talks about propitiation, because it talks about whether it will be acceptable, that is the language of offering, the language of sacrifices. And that is his hint. And Siftei Chachamim, which, as I mentioned, is a super commentary on Rashi, tries to explain the logic that Rashi is following. With this, Rashi is answering the question, which you probably didn't even know you had: how do we know that you shall make it as a free will offering, or nidava, means for the repair of the temple? Right? Did Rashi just like pull that out of thin air? And for the fulfillment of a vow, the neder offering, means for the altar. Rashi's just acting like this is assumed. Perhaps it is the opposite. But he answers, what dedicated thing, right? What is something that is dedicated? Say this is the dedicated animal intended for the altar. Therefore, since it will not be favorably accepted, right, and not be propitiation, refers to the altar, then you shall make it as a free will offering. The nidava obviously refers to dedication for the repair of the temple. Rem, another sage, explains that since most free will offerings are for the repair of the temple, and most vows are for the altar, the Torah therefore refers to the repair of the house as a free will offering, and to the altar sacrifices as a vow. All right, so this is a nice little glimpse of how you apply logic to understand texts of the Torah, which might appear unwilling to share their secrets, but it's not that they're unwilling, they're just expecting you to do a little work. So if we're talking about being acceptable, then clearly it has to be something on the altar, because that is the language of the altar. And if it is for the altar, then what would the contrast be? Something not for the altar. And what are things that are not for the altar? Those are gifts that are taken, sold, and the proceeds used for the temple maintenance. So step by step, we can see that the commentary is helping us understand this passage. And we're going to come back to the concept of blemishes in just a second, but I want to make sure that we understand the steps that were taken to create this distinction, or rather to illuminate the distinction the Torah already created as between that which goes to the altar and that which is sold for other purposes. So any questions on that part? Okay, the rabbi's logic is undeniable. So let's talk a little bit in Sforno language about why this might be the case that it is. Even though numerous blemishes may be apparent, you may donate them for the temple treasury, although the donor thought that on account of these blemishes, they would be rejected by the temple treasurer. So he's trying to make it clear that actually you can have some significant blemishes on an animal that's being donated to the temple, as long as it's being donated for the treasury rather than the altar. Even if you thought that it might not be accepted, the long leg, the short leg, the uncloven hoof that had been mutated closed, you might have thought this probably won't be good enough, they won't accept it, but they do. Why? The Torah differentiates between gifts for the temple treasury and animals destined for the altar, as Rashi tried to explain. Now, why, though, is there that differentiation? Whereas even minor blemishes disqualify an animal from being offered on the altar, no such restrictions apply to gifts known as nidava, the free will offerings. This is possible because the bodies of such animals do not possess any sanctity. Such sanctity only applies to their value, to the price tag, if you will. That is, to the money realized from the sale of such animals. This enables the body, which was donated, to be treated as if it had never been sanctified in any way. So this concept of sanctification of an item that is being brought to the temple can be a little confusing to the modern world because we don't have an exact parallel. But what Sforno is trying to clear up for us is that when you donate an animal for sale to the temple, that the animal itself is not made sanctified. It's not holy. Yes, the value is sanctified, and you couldn't sell the animal and take the money and, go buy a new iPhone, but the animal's physical form, the physical body of the animal is not sanctified. You are donating a vehicle for currency. You are not donating the animal in and of and for itself, which is very different than when you donate for the altar. When you donate something that will be sacrificed, when you make that type of vow and dedication, then you are saying this animal in particular is going to be on the sacrificial altar for the purposes that I specify. And therefore, this animal in particular has to be fit, has to be without blemish in order for it to be on that altar. Which is going to lead us to the next question, but I just want to double check that everyone is following that that distinction in this point. All right, so the next question, at least as far as I am thinking, is, well, why should it make a difference whether the animal is going into the treasury or whether the animal is going on the altar? I mean, after all, don't we always say it's the thought that counts? The fact that I donated an animal that was blemished, maimed, or whatever, well, you know, is that really such a problem? And if the fact that, you know, the animal isn't going on the altar, does that really okay, right? In either direction, we could either be taking the leniency from the donation of the treasury animal and applying it to the altar animal, or we could take the stringency of that which is brought to the altar and try and apply it more leniently, more stringently to the animal brought as a donation. Why draw a difference between these two? Why make that distinction? Indeed, why go so far as Sefer HaChinuch gives us in his summary of this mitzvah to say that it is a violation, right, to even make a blemish on a sanctified animal. That it's not only that we cannot bring an animal to the altar that it has a blemish, that means an animal that was blemish-free that you then put a blemish onto is also a violation. It's a transgression. That you have damaged something that was dedicated for the altar. That is a problem. As he says, the root of this commandment are since there would be a disgrace to the consecrated animals with this. This prohibition is practiced in every place and at all times by males and females, meaning both men and women are subject to it, but there is only a liability for lashings as punishment at the time that the temple is in existence, such that the beast would be fitting as a sacrifice, as elucidated in the Gemara, Avodah Zarah 13b. So he is saying that, yes, we don't actually, if someone were to make an animal and say, I dedicate this animal for the temple, first of all, don't. If they did, then that animal would technically be in a state of semi-consecration, and making a blemish on it would be a violation of the commandment, but we wouldn't punish you for it because there's no way that animal could be sacrificed because there is no temple. But the more interesting part that we need to keep in mind is that he is saying that the reason why this is put in place in the first place, the reason why we're not allowed to have blemished animals or make a blemish upon an animal that is being offered, is because this would be disgraceful. It would be disgracing the animal that was consecrated. And I'm still trying to figure out why. Why would that be a problem? Who cares what the animal looks like? It's going to be dead in a minute, and you know, that's over. Why do I care that my animal doesn't have a blemish? And to go back to our discussion of steers and animal husbandry, it doesn't make sense. If I've got an animal that is of good stock and has no flaws in it, and it is, you know, the perfect, hardy, strong, perfect example of the animal, whether you know, whatever type of animal it is, I want that animal to make more animals. I want that animal to be used as my breeding stock. I do not want to put that animal on the altar and kill it. Why in the world would I take my best and reduce it to death in this way and not get the exceptional benefit that I would expect from it for my livelihood, which for most people at this time was wrapped up in the farming endeavor.
But
All right.
you just answered your own question.
Yes.
Why would you take your best and offer it on the altar? Because God is the most important thing, in your life and in your community, and to whom you owe your very existence.
Absolutely. We hold God as being the most important thing, but does God really want me to suffer through this? Right? Does God really want me to lose out on this? As much as I want to extol and praise God, does God need my best animal? I mean, it's not helping God any. Wouldn't God be happier if I were able to keep this animal and use one of the animals that I have no use for worshiping God? I mean, it shouldn't make any difference to God, but it makes a difference to me. And God clearly wants me to be better off, right? I mean, isn't that what we believe? Now, that exact line of thinking is where Sefer HaChinuch is going in his next commentary. But did you have more to add, John?
No, that's it.
Okay, so I think you'll find that you're in good company with Sefer HaChinuch, who teases out the emotions that you are hinting at. So he gives a much longer discussion in a much earlier section of his work, when the idea of building a Mishkan for God is first presented, which really, hopefully you have considered this at some point, and if not, you should now, a kind of weird idea. The idea of building a Mishkan, a house for God, and then later on the Beit HaMikdash, the temple in Jerusalem. Why are we doing this? And why would God tell us to do this? I mean, you might have said, oh, well, humans are humans. They're stupid. They'll do anything. But God told us to do this, at least the Mishkan. There's a little bit more debate about the temple. So he tries to give the understanding, the both emotional, psychological, and spiritual understanding of why we are doing this. We are obligated to say that the building of the house for God, may he be blessed, for us to do our prayers and sacrifices to him in it, it shall all be prepared, it is all to prepare our hearts to his service. That is for our benefit. It is going to be about building this for God is actually building it for us. It is not from his need to sit in the house of people and to come under the shade of their beams, whether they built it from cedars of Lebanon or from cypresses, as the heavens and the heavens of the heavens cannot contain him, and they stand by his spirit, meaning surely the house that people built would not be needed for his glory, God forbid. Right? The world, including all of the heavens of heavens, only exists because God wills them to exist. And it's not as though God needs a tent or even the temple of Jerusalem to be more glorious, because God has built an entire universe. No matter what we build, no matter how fancy it looks, no matter how fine the gold work, come on. If people want to say that God is amazing, they're not going to be looking at the temple first. They're going to be looking at, the moon, which is floating around us constantly, or the oceans, or the mountains, or anything else of God's creation that was unshaped by human hands, speaks much more highly of God's greatness and glory than does anything that we make with our hands. So we're not actually adding anything to God with this, right? We're not actually giving God a place to sit. So that means there has to be a purpose other than it's for God. Yes, it's for God in the sense of how we conceptualize it, but it's not its purpose. That is to say, the purpose is not to benefit God. As he goes on to say, are the things not known and clear that it is all for the refinement of our bodies? And by that he means our life in general. But with a very specific twist, as bodies are refined by actions and by the multiplication of good actions and their great constancy, and the thoughts of the heart become purified, cleansed, sanitized, and God desires the good of the creatures. So quick summary, and then we'll get on to the implications. He is saying, look, we are human beings. That means that we are bodies, and we are souls and bodies bound and interwoven with each other. And the body, the life that we have, is made better by how we act. that we need actions in order to make this life better. We are physical creatures, therefore we need physical actions. And with the right physical actions, good actions, and doing them always, then the heart, the deeper part of our spirit, becomes purified, becomes cleansed, becomes sanitized, it becomes stronger and better, and that is the good that God desires for us. Right. With that as a general idea of how the body and mind and soul work, therefore, he commanded us to fix a place that would be pure and completely clean, to purify the thoughts of people there and to refine their hearts towards him in it. So he is saying that with this goal in mind, that good action makes for a good body, makes for a good heart, going through the line of the physical to reach the deepest essence of us, that there needed to be a place, at least, that was of perfect example of purity and of cleanliness, in the sense of being the most refined example of what the world should be. And that place, of course, is going to be the Mishkan, and then later the temple. That place for us to participate and connect to that level of beautiful action, of good action. And through the refinement of action and the purification of thought that we will have there, our minds will rise to clinging with the highest mind, which is a phrase meaning God. So by having this perfect place, we will be able to elevate from our more imperfect moment into a greater connection to that which is ultimately perfect, meaning God. So the temple then was a necessary element of giving us this location, this opportunity where we could change ourselves into a higher and higher level of connection with God. That means that we will add other things onto the simple meaning and say that it is from this fruit that God commanded us to always sacrifice from things about which the heart of man covets, meaning we sacrifice from the stuff we want, not the stuff God wants, the stuff we want, like meat and wine and bread, so that the heart be more aroused, awakened with this matter. It obligated the poor person even to bring from his little flour that his eyes and hearts are upon all of the day. The idea that we offer what is best and what we want most, because that is what awakens within us the seriousness and the significance of what we are doing. If we were to offer something that was second best or even worst, then we wouldn't be slighting God in the sense that God would be upset. What we would instead be doing is diminishing the value of the action by having given something that we ourselves do not have any close attachment to. By giving something that we do have attachment to, that does matter to us, then we are teaching ourselves through our action, going into ourselves, we are teaching ourselves that this matters. Now, this is something that modern psychology has picked up on greatly, with the idea that by changing the way you act, you can change the way you feel and think. But apparently Judaism has known this for quite some time. Not that surprising, really, given our source. But that is what we are learning about, why we are not offering blemishes, why we are not allowing other people to eat from the sacrifices, why we wouldn't allow people that were ritually impure to come. It is not because any of those things ultimately matter or benefit or harm God, but because those things do matter to us. And we would lack the focus, the understanding, the benefit of what is meant to be happening in these places if we were to allow them to be done in ways that diminished our respect for them. Now, that's hard for us to understand, I think, sometimes, because we have this idea of, well, we should just try harder and we should be better people and we should just be our best self and not be so petty. But I hate to break it to you, but human beings always will be at least a little petty, at least to start. Yes, we can refine ourselves. That's the whole point of what he's trying to say here. But we don't start at that level. And demanding that a person have elevated themselves to the point where offering even the most repulsive of animal and even the most repulsive of conditions will still allow them to feel that they are elevating themselves, demanding that of somebody who is just beginning their spiritual life, whether they are young or whether they are coming to God later in life, is simply too much to ask. It's not the way human beings work. And thus, we needed to set up certain requirements so that a person will be able to rise in those stages, rise in those steps by having themselves participate in something that they can immediately recognize through the lens of this world as being beautiful, dignified, honorable, worthy, expensive, pick whichever adjective you want, taking a value they already have and then transferring it to something which has more infinite value to draw themselves higher and higher. It's an unfortunate part of being human. It's also being human, in which case we don't lament it, we work with it. Questions before we move on to his next point? All right, then let's talk about another way that this helps move us. There is another arousal of the heart with animal sacrifices from the angle of similarity. As human and animal bodies are similar in all of their matters, they are only differentiated that in this one, intellect was given into it and not into that one. There's a little difference there. But apart from that, humans, as I just heard a great quote, humans are monkeys with car keys, right? We are basically animals in most every way that you can imagine, except for there is a rational, intellectual, spiritual component. Intellect means all of those things in the writings of the medieval scholars. And when the human body leaves the realm of the intellect at the time of the sin, he must know that he has entered the realm of animals at that time, as this is the only thing that differentiates them. Meaning that if a person was able to keep to that full intellect, rational, spiritual life that sets us apart from animals, we would never make mistakes. When we do make mistakes, it is clear that during those moments, we are losing that unique human component, that we are becoming like another animal with car keys, meaning that we have lost the true essence of what it is to be human. And therefore, he is commanded to take a body of flesh like him and bring it to the place chosen for the raising of the intellect, and to burn it there, and to forget its memory. It shall be completely incinerated. It shall not be remembered, and it shall not be thought of, corresponding to his body, in order to form a strong image in his heart that any matter of a body without intellect is lost and completely null. He should thus rejoice in his portion as of an intelligent soul, which God has graced him, and which exists forever. So by seeing the body be incinerated, by seeing the sin offering in particular, in this case, being destroyed, he is able to focus and say, that's me without the spiritual part that God has given me, right? I am just flesh and bone. I am just blood and dust. I am ash. I am nothing, just like what is being consumed on the altar. Therefore, I should take greater care of the spiritual part of me, because that is the part that is uniquely human, and that is the part that is uniquely eternal. The sacrifice was thus transformative of a person to help them understand the full implication of their mistakes and the full implications of their potential. And let it not be difficult to you in putting down this reason, how it is that we would ever bring a voluntary offering, right? It's like, wait a minute, if the only reason we're doing this is because of the there but for my intellect go I, why would I ever bring a voluntary offering? As our reason also explains voluntary offerings, since we have said that a sacrifice is an illustration of the lowering of bodies and the elevation of soul, the sacrificer will find benefit to lessen even without a known sin. Meaning that even a person who wants to bring a sacrifice for another purpose can, if they are doing it correctly, find spiritual benefit, even if they are not atoning for a particular mistake, but instead are just using it as a chance to reflect upon their place within life and their place within eternity. That the sacrifices could always have that benefit, regardless of why the person was bringing it. So what Sefer HaChinuch is trying to say, and indeed I believe the commentators in general, is that the details of who can offer, who can eat, and what can be offered are not there as niggling regulations in order to bedevil us as we try to seek spiritual uplift, but they are necessary components of training us to go from where we start as humans, which are just a little bit better than animals, and to take from things that we like, to take from things that we value, and to transform them through this purpose into educational tools that will allow us spiritually to look at the world in a different light and to look at ourselves in a different light, and allow us to thus climb higher and higher and higher into that spiritual understanding and to that spiritual realm. This is the ultimate elevation. And that is something that can continue to happen anytime we perform a mitzvah in any of the modern settings. We don't have some temple sacrifices anymore. But whether it is engaging in tefillah, in prayer, or whether it is engaging in the mitzvah of giving tzedakah, or the mitzvah of being honest in business, of controlling your speech and not gossiping or slandering or slurring other people, or whether it be any of the celebrations of the holidays, any of the commandments, are taking our physical actions and we are doing them in a beautiful way where we put our full attention and our full effort to them, whether it be having a lovely Kiddush cup or whether it be having a more lovely meal for Shabbat than we would during the week, in some way that we are externalizing our desire to elevate ourselves through this action in front of us in something that will be immediately recognized by our physical self as worthwhile and desirable, so that we will then attach that value to the ultimate meaning of the mitzvah and allow ourselves to drift higher and higher and higher through this process. It's not easy. It does demand, if you'll pardon the English pun, sacrifice, but it has the benefit of allowing us to move more easily and more consistently than simply sitting around waiting for enlightenment, inspiration, and spiritual elevation. There is much we can do, and if we do it with dignity and with honor, we will find that it allows us to grow. There is always a danger of spiritual materialism, of becoming too fixated on the physical realm, but we also have a danger of being expecting us to be completely detached from the physical realm. Finding that balance of using the physical as a way of directing ourselves to reach a higher level, that is what Judaism asks us to do every time we perform a commandment. Questions or comments?
A comment, but I keep on thinking about Hannah and Elkanah, who with great effort take this journey to be in the particular time, a particular place. And it ties in with the next section, which talks about Moadim, the appointed times, which is not just about a time, but also a place.
Right.
And the effort that is exercised and done to do what they do. And also the willingness to sacrifice the bull, the annual bull. There's a level of trust, a trust that God, who provided them with this perfect animal, will provide them with additional blessings. That God's storehouse of blessings is so unlimited, we cannot conceive of it. But that it kind of forces us to trust that that storehouse will be open for us again, just as we give this valuable animal. So too, God will provide something again at an appointed time, at an appointed place. And that's kind of why we keep on going, trusting in the process, the unrolling of time.
And recognizing that the ultimate value that we gain from the involvement in these actions is greater than the immediate value of the pretty bull, of the fancy animal. That we may value that temporarily, but against the scale of eternity, really that cow is not all that important. And Elkanah is a great example because according to rabbinic understanding, he would make quite a procession of going to Jerusalem for the pilgrimage festivals, because he wanted everybody along the route to feel inspired and to want to participate in this action as well. So he not only recognized for himself that bringing the best would be allowing himself to be elevated, but that by showing other people the outward displays of this celebration and the demonstrating this physicality of the enjoyment would also inspire them to take those steps towards Jerusalem and towards that elevation. So he was doing it for himself and also a great role model for others. Other questions or comments?
Okay, I have a question. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Maybe I'm a farmer. I have no idea, but you know me better. I've got a question that has to do with how were they supposed to bring, like a pilgrimage holiday, a perfect animal that has, I mean, we're talking about animals have to be in herds, or you can't put a rope around them because they cause a blemish on them. I mean, the practicality, I always thought that there must have been like large corrals around Jerusalem with where you would buy an animal, you know, it's perfect, that you wouldn't necessarily be taking it from your herd to take a week to get to from northern Israel to Jerusalem. I mean, that seems really inconceivable to me that you could have a totally perfect animal and it'd be unblemished after that.
Well, so
And
there
the
are
other thing
blemishes,
is-
right? Well, let me handle that first. There are blemishes and there are blemishes. So that's why the Torah gives us a list, and as you could see in the Torah, the list of blemishes were quite severe. They were not, just the cow had a chip in its hoof. And that really is something that gets a lot more attention in Jewish law of what counts as a blemish, what doesn't count as a blemish. There is a great deal of detail there. So it wouldn't be hard to find an animal that was blemish free. The animals did not have an impossible beauty standard like people expect now with airbrushing in magazines. The animals were able to be perfect for this purpose without winning the county fair and being like only 1 in a million kind of beast.
The county fair. Okay.
Right.
Okay, my other question is, if you were, which I thought was very clever, the fundraising for the Mishkan and the temple were the blemished animals. Okay, but what happened to those animals? Because you couldn't eat them. I mean, if they were blemished, you couldn't.
But blemish doesn't
forget
mean
about the Mishkan, but
right. But blemish doesn't mean not kosher.
They weren't kosher.
No, they most of them still would have been kosher.
Okay, so
you can have the ugliest cow in the world that's like blind or whatever, and it's still a kosher cow. There are other rules that require the cow to be healthy in certain ways. But as far as external physical blemishes, which might diminish its ability to be sacrificed, those did not usually harm the ability for it to be eaten as just food.
Okay. So, I didn't know if there was a black market on lambs and sheep and, animals that were sold outside the country or something.
And remember, most of the animals.
Now I understand.
Right. And remember, most of the animals also had a use other than food. In fact, most animals that were raised and kept were not turned into food. They were turned into other resources, whether it be milk from goats or hair and wool from the sheep, or milk or labor from the cows. So there are lots of other things you can do with an animal than put it on the dinner table.
Yeah.
That was the old joke of the Middle Ages, that if a Jew is eating a chicken, one of them was sick.
Okay. That's still the truth.
So we'll leave it there for today.
Okay.
Thank you all for studying. Hopefully, we're
Okay,
seeing
and
at
call
some.
me.
Yeah, I'll talk to you about the other details for this afternoon. But hopefully, you all get the benefit that we can see from
Okay.
studying about the sacrifices. That it's not just boring or archaic details. That this does have a meaning not only for our ancestors but for us as well. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.